Good evening. I'm delighted to see fellow passionate Canadian history and Canadian business history enthusiasts on a conference panel this afternoon, and I watched a bit of that. Red Wilson and Joe Martin. I served, as Joe mentioned, on the historic board with Red Wilson, who was the co-founder, and as a past director and chair. Joe Martin and I also have a serious interest in Canadian military history, as does our keynote speaker this evening, who I'm pleased to introduce. Jim Leech is a man of many accomplishments. Science graduate from Royal Military College, an MBA from Queen's University, where he currently serves as Chancellor. And if I ever forget that, his cottage, which is across the bay from mine, has a Queen's flag, winter and summer. Flaps in the wind. So I also saw you on a few intercollegiate games televised last year, and you were being interviewed halftime with your Queen's regalia on. As a McGill graduate, I find it interesting. You're a great Chancellor. He is the retired CEO of Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Prior to joining Teachers, he was CEO of Unicorp and Union Energy. He was special advisor to the Ontario Ministry of Finance concerning the electoral sector pension sustainability. His other responsibilities include senior advisor with McKinsey and Company, board chairs of two foundations, Toronto General and Western Hospital Foundation, and the MasterCard Foundation, and is a founding director of the Right to Play International. He was appointed special advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada with regard to the establishment of the Infrastructure Bank. He's also the honorary colonel of the 32nd Signal Regiment of the Canadian Armed Forces, and he comes from a long line of military officers. Said it took him a while to become a colonel. He has done important work with the True Patriot Love Foundation and was a member of Canada's largest expedition, which skied to the magnetic North Pole to raise awareness and funds for Canadian military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He has received numerous awards and honours, including the Order of Canada. During his tenure as CEO at Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which is a $140 billion plan, which represents the retirement savings for over 310,000 members, was ranked first in the world for investment performance and customer service. In 2014, he co-authored The Third Rail, Confronting Our Pension Failures, an award-winning book that chronicled the challenges facing today's pension plans. His speech tonight on past, present, and future of pension plans in Canadian business history will review the evolution of Canadian pension plans from the late 1800s to today. Both as providers of retirement security and as investors in our economy, including references to Ontario Teachers Pension Plan throughout his talk. He will also provide his views on how the future may unfold with respect to pension plans. Please welcome Jim Leech.
Thank you very much, John. I had to come up here with my Apple because I was reviewing my speech notes just before coming up and realized that one of the pages was missing, which is kind of a shock you get when you're giving a speech. So I've got that one page. I'll switch over and read from my Apple. But anyway, thank you very much, John, for that introduction. And this truly is a celebratory year. 175 years for my university, Queen's, 150 years for our country, Canada, and heavens, Expo 67 just feels as though it was yesterday. 100 years since the formal establishment of what we now know as the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, and 70 years since I was born. So these are all big milestones, and I'm pleased that you've given me the opportunity to take a moment to pause and reflect on the past, the present, and the future. So I've been asked to discuss pension plans and how they have evolved and impacted Canada over the past century and a half, and what the future may hold. And this is a story of evolution and Canadian innovation, from ad hoc, informal schemes to keep surviving workers out of poverty for the short period between work succession and death, into that most highly successful economic engine that is the envy of the world. In Canada, we're fortunate. Our pension plans have been able to jump on opportunities and even turbocharge our economy, as well as provide retirement security for millions. In most other mature economies, their pension plans are actually a huge drag on their future, where ours, as I say, will be a turbocharger. Now, I said that it's the 100th year since the creation of Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, and that's correct from the perspective that it was 1917 when the plan was formally created. However, there was an ad hoc plan for teachers that was set up by Egerton Ryerson that dates back to the pre-Confederation days of Upper Canada. Those pensions were funded by an annual grant of £500 for teachers who were, quote, worn out of service to their country, unquote. The plan was to dole out £6 for each year of service to old teachers who could demonstrate that they were indigent and of good moral standing. And if you go on the Ontario Government Archives website, you can actually see applications for pensions dating back to 1853. These applications contain medical documents, certificates of character, statement of teaching experience, and other documents supporting the needs of the applicants. In addition, files also show correspondence between department officials and the applicants and their representatives, and also people providing the certificates of character. So the decision to accept or refuse any application under this ad hoc system was made by the Superintendent of Public Instruction on the recommendation of the Education Office. Now, Ryerson thought that he had this great funding formula. He thought it was sound, but he soon learned what every Chief Executive Officer of Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan knows, and that's that Ontario teachers never die as planned. As a consequence, shortly after the beginning, pensions had to be reduced to only £2 per year of service. But teachers actually is not the earliest Canadian plan. New Brunswick passed an 1839 Pension Act for the relief of old soldiers of the Revolutionary War. In exchange for a petition that confirmed their loyal service to the King and indigent circumstances, soldiers would receive £10 per year. In another Canadian first, North America's first corporate pension plan was created by the Grand Trunk Railway in 1873. And then in 1885, the Bank of Montreal introduced a pension plan, and by the early 1900s, most bank employees could dream of earning an annual pension of as much as $1,000 upon retirement. So through this period, though, the benefits were largely illusory. Since the employer was funding any pensions paid, they called the shots. For example, workers had to work for 10 years before becoming eligible. If employees were disloyal, they were disqualified, and both Grand Trunk and the Canadian Pacific Railway yanked pensions from workers who joined legal strikes in the 1900s. And of course, you had to be male to even qualify. A great irony about these conditional pensions is that most employees didn't live long enough to collect their pension. When the Grand Trunk introduced their plan in 1874, average life expectancy was about 55 years. So the average worker had likely been dead for 15 years before he became eligible to collect his pension. Accordingly, Any pensions actually paid were actually paid out of the corporation's current earnings. These pay-as-you-go ad hoc conditional plans started to change in the 1920s and 30s as life expectancies started to catch up to retirement age and workers started to actually live long enough to collect their pension for at least a couple of years. And that caused the formalization of many of the plans, for example, the creation of the Ontario Teachers Superannuation Fund in 1917. It was in this era where pension plans started to evolve as savings pools, pools of capital. Employees were now asked to contribute a small portion of their wages so that when combined with the employer's contributions, a pool of assets could be built up over time to fund the future pensions. Pension benefits would be based on years of service and compensation level, and eventually women were even allowed into these plans. This formalization also allowed plan administrators to start to measure the adequacy of the asset pool to meet future liabilities. And I actually went back and dug out the actuarial report from Ontario Teachers from 1920. It showed total assets of about $14.4 million. Total liabilities. So that was the value of pensions to be granted to survivors of the 16,481 working teachers, plus the value of returns on death to such of those teachers as will die in service, is the wording, and the value of pensions to 299 persons who were then on pension. So they only had 299 people they were paying, but they had 16,481 actual teachers coming along. On the asset side, there was the value of the funds on hand was about $3 million. And then there were future contributions from the teachers and the government, which was each $4,775,000. And if you've done the math, that leaves you with a deficit of about $1.8 million. So right from the get-go, the plan was in deficit. But the actuary, who was identified in the report as your obedient servant, Mr. M.A. McRae, he wasn't so worried that the fund was only 80% funded. He forecast that it would be in surplus within 4 years, provided that new entrants to the fund paid their full fare. I particularly enjoyed his wording around his warning about not paying refunds while the plan was in deficit. He said, quote, "We cannot eat our cake and also keep it for the hungry teacher in his old age," unquote. That's the most interesting wording I've ever seen in an actuarial report, I can tell you. Must have been an extrovert. Actually, things did work out pretty well for the next few decades as the asset pools in these funds started to grow. The next big milestone was in the 1950s, and it's what's known as the Treaty of Detroit. And that's when General Motors and the United Auto Workers agreed to the establishment of a pension scheme that quickly spread throughout the auto industry and to most other unionized workplaces. And most of today's defined benefit plans can trace their benefit structure to this treaty. Embedded in collective agreements, these pension rights all of a sudden became a legal obligation of the sponsoring employer. And through contract bargaining, the unions gradually increased the benefit levels over the ensuing decades, adding bells and whistles such as early retirement, survivor benefits, and inflation indexation. These plans became so popular that soon close to 50% of all Canadian workers were members of corporate union or government-sponsored pension plans. And following the private and public sector's endorsement of this form of pension plan in order to ensure that all Canadians had some sort of retirement security, the Canadian government introduced the Canada Pension Plan in 1966. But there were some who were worried that these plans were not the panacea that everybody thought they were, particularly Peter Drucker. In his 1976 classic, The Unseen Revolution, he warned that what General Motors had really initiated was a long-term guarantee that would shoulder the auto industry with unaffordable retirement bills. Drucker also had some macroeconomic warnings. He predicted that institutional investors, particularly pension plans, will become the controlling owners of all American large companies. In other words, through pension fund ownership, the means of production would become socialized without becoming nationalized. Accordingly, he felt that it was critical that these plans be managed properly. His other predictions were that a major health care issue would be longevity, that pensions and Social Security would become central to the American economy and society, that the retirement age would have to be extended, and that altogether American politics would be increasingly dominated by middle-class issues and the values of elderly people. Kind of sounds familiar. While readers at that time found these conclusions very hard to accept, especially his conclusion that the increasing dominance of pension funds represents one of the most startling power shifts in economic history, today his work looks pretty prescient. In fairness, it was easy to ignore his warnings. The last 2 decades of that 20th century were good times, and the system was working really well. Sponsoring corporations were even making money off the plans in that the actuarial return requirements were well below what the pools of savings were actually earning. In other words, the sponsors were actually earning a spread on the pension savings. This led to contribution holidays and even surplus removals, a short-term windfall to any corporate CFO. And of course, there was lots of room to give back to the employee bargaining demands to increase benefits. I mean, what the heck? Sweetening the pension benefits did not impact the current P&L, as the sponsor was not required to include pension status in his financial statements. The costs would not show up for 20 years, not my problem, that's the next guy's issue. It was smooth sailing, and everyone was happy. There was an added benefit for many of the government-sponsored plans. These pools of employer and employee savings became a captive funder of the government's own finances. So, for example, Canada Pension Plan was restricted to investing in federal and provincial debt. Ontario Teachers Pension Plan could only invest in Ontario provincial debentures. And federal tax laws limited the amount of pension savings that could be invested outside the country. So is it true that all good things must come to an end? Well, it certainly was in this case. Towards the end of the century, the music stopped as a bunch of bad things started to conspire against these plans. First of all, the liabilities started to grow as retirees started to live longer, and benefits were sweetened. Investment returns became less certain, and in order to earn more to fund these increased liabilities, plans started to take on more and more investment risk. But they were ill-equipped to make such investment decisions, and with risk came volatility. The dot-com crash as a good example in the financial crisis. Actual returns fell far below the previously assumed rates of return. And then finally, the regulators started to require a sponsoring organization to include changes in the status of its pension plan into its current P&L. So much for the free ride. Analysts started to view General Motors as a pension plan that made cars on the side. So the chaos of these past 2 decades caused many plan sponsors to withdraw from providing pensions. In the private sector, there has been a huge migration from defined benefit structure, where the pension amounts are fixed and guaranteed, to the defined contribution structure, which is really only a savings account. This has resulted in a massive risk transfer from the sponsor, the employer, to the employee who has proved totally incapable of managing this risk. So as a partial response, governments introduced tax incentives to save, such as the Registered Retirement Savings Plan, but that's been a complete failure. Students of the math of this, a little bit on pensions here, students of math of the pension plans find this trend disturbing, as it's clear that the cost of providing a fixed amount of retirement income is far less expensive under a defined benefit structure than under a defined contribution structure. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it's straight math. And it's largely due to the ability to pool investment and longevity risk under a defined benefit plan. Unfortunately, this logic has not prevailed with corporate CFOs who are simply interested in getting this uncontrollable liability off my balance sheet and income statement. Their incentive system is not impacted if retired employees are struggling. For them, volatile earnings per share is simply a no-no. Public sector plans are a very different story. I suspect that they simply found it impossible to unilaterally switch to defined contribution, and so they had to make the best of seemingly a bad hand. In the 1990s, they started to privatize. Fortunately, they borrowed advice from Drucker's unseen revolution. He said, "The new institutions we have created to administer and invest pension monies must have adequate management and be rendered legitimate. They have to be autonomous institutions, be accountable to their constituency, and free from any suspicion of conflict of interest." In practice, this meant have a clear mission, establish independent governance with professional boards of directors and highly skilled management, and in many cases going as far as joint employee-employer sponsorship. So Ontario Teachers was the forerunner in the 1990s, and most other public sector plans have been modeled after teachers. And this is what the world has named and envies the Canadian or the Maple Leaf model. You see both terms used. Most other countries didn't have the foresight to understand what Drucker was even talking about. The result is that the Canadian model plans have outperformed their counterparts across the world in terms of investment performance, customer service, and innovation. They were the first to invest in real estate, the first in private equity, the first in infrastructure, the first in commodities, and the first in derivatives. While the U.S. states and the municipalities fail one after another, and it will continue, under the burden of their insolvent plans, by and large the Canadian plans are all in surplus. And as Drucker had predicted, as the assets within these enlightened public pension plans have grown, they've become a major force in our economy, both as a provider of buying power for our citizens and as an investor in businesses and funder of governments, and worldwide as formidable investors. Whereas most U.S. pension plans are in serious deficits and hence will suck resources from their economies for many years to come, Canadian plans are largely in great shape and they'll act as an economic stimulus. These plans play an incredibly important role in our economy today. I often get the feeling that some people think that pensions represent dead money, a sort of a tax. Somehow those funds go into a black box, never to be seen, but that's not true. Take, for example, Canada's 10 largest plans are recognized as world leaders. They manage over $1.1 trillion, half of which is invested in Canada, including many of our landmark assets. Together, they provide employment for 11,000 men and women professionals. 3 of the funds are listed among the top 20 public pension plans globally. Additionally, the top 10 remain prominent global players in the alternative asset management, with 7 funds named among the top 30 global infrastructure investors and 5 listed as part of the top 30 real estate investors. On the other side, the income received by pensioners from those 10 largest plans in 2012 is estimated to be between $68 and $72 billion per year. These pensioners pay $14 to $16 billion in taxes each year, money that is sorely needed to deliver health care and all of our other services. And they spend $56 to $63 billion on goods and services. These numbers are undoubtedly higher today. A recent study by Boston Consulting Group concluded that these pensions alone are an economic engine in their own right, especially in smaller communities. In fact, in Ontario, defined benefit pensions form 12% of total earnings of all small towns. It actually bumps up to 18% when you include CPP, OAS, and GIS. So as we cross the 150-year mark, I would note that Drucker's predictions continue to ring true. The pension industry will become increasingly important as Canada has 5,000 new retirees every week, and this will grow to 8,000 by the year 2020. So over the next 20 years, it's expected that 7 million Canadians will exit their jobs for retirement that will last far longer than any one of us had ever predicted. Now, unfortunately, the percentage of workers who are members of workplace pension plans has dropped precipitously. And membership in defined benefit plans now is basically confined, unfortunately, to just government employees. The rest of Canadians have to rely on social security plans, the Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, Guaranteed Income Supplement, and their own savings. In the book that John mentioned that Jackie McNish and I wrote a couple of years ago, we discussed what we believe are 3 effective and affordable proposals that address most of the problems that we have today in Canada. The first was to introduce an enhanced CPP for the forgotten middle. Second was to redefine defined benefits to reflect today's demographic reality. And the third was to create a defined contribution model that really actually does work and doesn't just pass the risk buck to the employee. And I'm pleased to say that action has already been taken on the first recommendation with a federal-provincial agreement forged last year. And you can quibble about the exact formula they agreed. I certainly do. But it still does go a long way to addressing the retirement security issue that middle-income earners face in Canada. The second recommendation is actually code for restructuring the remaining 1950s defined benefit plans to mirror the Canadian model. We felt that a wholesale switch of those struggling DB plans to DC was really counterproductive. Instead, these new evolved plans could offer a base benefit guarantee with additional benefits contingent upon investment performance. With such an approach, we can immediately address an aspect of risk and reward sharing among all the parties that promotes sustainability and better governance. And I'm pleased to say I know that there's a big initiative going on amongst the universities, and I believe that they're making great progress to actually take many of those plans and evolve them so they'll be far more sustainable. But what can we do to help the people already in inadequate DC plans and the 60% of employees who have no workplace pension whatsoever? There must be ways to build a better defined contribution plan for small businesses and the self-employed. What lessons can we learn from the past? So our third recommendation really had 3 things. One is if you're going to set up a DC plan, enrollment needs to be mandatory. It's far too easy to put savings off, and the future has a funny way of catching up with us. All we have to do is look at the failure of the RRSP system to validate that. We can pool investments and use efficiencies to reduce costs, and we can offer fewer investment fund choices. I mean, it still always blows my mind when I go look at most defined contribution plans and they got, 50 investment options. Like, that's just, most employees are incapable of dealing with that. We must also require an unitization which addresses the longevity risk and gets those plans closer to the security of a defined benefit plan. I believe that this will be the next frontier for the Canadian plans who have shown so much innovation to date, and I hope I'm even partially as prescient as Drucker. Canada has shown the ability to stay out in front of this retirement security issue, and in doing so we have created huge economic engines. And we need to continue with that spirit of innovation and nonconformity. So let me conclude by leaving you with 4 thoughts. Retirement income adequacy is one of the most important social issues we will face over the next couple of decades as so many Canadians retire. So it's important to get it right. Drucker predicted it. In the long run, it's far more cost-effective to confront our pension failures today by improving pension coverage and adequacy than to wait and deal with it later via the social welfare system. And finally, the pensions are critical to our economy, DB pensions even more so, through consumer spending, taxes paid, and investment dollars. And we ignore that impact and minimize the importance of its reality at our own economic peril. Thank you very much, and I'd be